So the skeletal system is our first system that we're going to go over. Remember, each part that I'm mentioning is going to be important for the quiz. I want to let you know that the quiz, I've decided, it needs to be on Friday and not tomorrow, because even though I need you to study tonight and continue to study, I think tonight is just, or tomorrow is just too quick, and I don't think you're going to do well if I give you that quiz on Wednesday. Rather, I'd like you to take your quiz on Friday, and but still study this material. If it's just too much to try to study in one evening. However, I also don't want you to study every detail. I want you to focus on the themes that I'm trying to express to you here. Stick to those themes, and anything I circle or highlight is important. You need to know it. Okay, well, the skeletal system is made of bone, and it's made of cartilage. So bones are made of calcified material. Cartilage is less calcified, so you have cartilage is softer, it bends, right? So you have a part of your chest cavities that has cartilage, and cartilage connects the ribs to the sternum. And there's a little piece even here, the xiphoid process. It's also made of cartilage, and this is much softer than the bone that attaches that is attached to the sternum, which is another bone, by this cartilage. Your nose is made of cartilage. You know that it flexes, and some of your joints contain cartilage that helps to soften any shock that happens. As you're born, your skeleton is made mostly of cartilage, and slowly that cartilage is replaced with bone. Bone is stiffer, harder. There's a part of the bone that's bone marrow where your blood cells are made. The key to the skeletal system is not that you know all the different parts, like mandible and maxilla and cranium, but that you understand that the bone itself is hard, it has qualities that allow for support for structure, and that each of the structures has a specific shape that works together in unison with other bones to do their function. For instance, here's the backbone. Its shape allows each of the particular sections of the backbone to sit one on top of the other. This allows the backbone to be flexible. Without it, we'd be walking around as if we had a stick on our back, and that's no good. But it also allows for protection of the spinal cord, which is a group of nerves that comes from the brain, and these neurons come down the spine. The spinal cord is actually made mostly of these nerve fibers that come down through the center of this tunnel, if you will, created by bone or surrounding it. And it's important that at each one of these vertebrae, we call these vertebrae, that the vertebrae actually have holes that allow for the nerves to come out and into the rest of the body. All right, so what's so important about the skeletal system? What do you need to know about the skeletal system for the quiz? That you have bone marrow that creates blood cells, that bone is different, and cartilage make up the skeletal system. Bone is hard and creates support. Cartilage helps connect bone to bone to reduce wearing away or tearing away of the pieces of bone, because bones do not necessarily grow back the way you'd like them to. Places like your nose, where you know it's better that the protrusion be flexible, is made of cartilage, and that at birth you were made mostly of cartilage, and that progresses into bone. Also, you need to understand that that the bone's shape determines its function, and that its function regulates what shape it could possibly have. For instance, your jaw wouldn't work if it didn't have a hinge. Without a hinge, this jaw would be useless. It'd be like your skull, right? So you have to, in order for your jaw to be a jaw, it has to have a hinge. So your mandibles, the number of shapes that this mandible can take, it only has so many variations. It has to have a hinge, and it has to have a flat side, so it opens and closes. It can close down on the food that it's supposed to take in. Now that's just an example, but the point is that the structure and function are closely related. So again, structure and function: bone is hard, cartilage is soft, bone marrow creates cells. The vertebra are, as an example, that structure and function. And that's pretty much it for this system. Here, this is an exercise for you to learn the human skull anatomy. I will not be asking you the human skull anatomy but it's important that you learn it because we're going to start looking at other animals once we start doing our dissections, and you're going to need to know what the different parts of the bones are, and different parts of the skull are, and how they work, and you'll compare this bone, this human skull, to other organism skulls, and you'll see how they're different. Here's an ear, the bones in the ear. It's also in the skull. That's why they have it here. This, I am going to ask you to know, these three little bones. So it really is the only part of the human skull that I need you to know. The three parts of the ear bone. That's for the quiz on Friday, and then again the test next week. Again, the skeletal system, just bone, cartilage, bone marrow, and you should know basic stuff like what's the pelvis. I'm not going to ask you the radius and ulna, the fibula and tibia, the femur. I think you should know the femur. It's the longest bone of your body. But I won't ask you the metatarsals and the phalanges. Phalanges are both these digits here and these digits here, right? And, there's stuff that you should know, like ulna and radius. These are bones that are part of your body. They're common. People know it. I should expect you to know these, but I'm not gonna hold you accountable to them for them on this Friday's quiz. But you should get to know them because by the time we're done dissecting animals, I am going to ask you to know most of these bones. Again, some more practice. The muscular system, there's so many muscles, it would be ridiculous for me to actually expect you to know all the names of the muscles. Again, bicep and tricep is something that is common knowledge, but again, I'm not going to stress the names of all the different muscles. You should know that there's skeletal muscle, that there's smooth muscle, and that there's cardiac muscle, and the qualities of each. You should know all three of those for Friday. You should know tendons attach muscle to bone, and that ligaments attach bones to bones. Those four things, those five things, you need to know those five things here. I'm not even going to ask you to know that biceps contract when you're pulling and triceps contract when you're pulling the ulna. I'm not going to expect that you know that. I'm not going to ask you for the trapezoid, the latissimus, and the occipitals. I'm not going to ask you to know these muscles, even though again they're muscles that you work out. That as you build your body, you'll get to know these muscles. I'm not going to ask you to know what the names of these muscles are. I am going to ask you to know. Again, I am. That's a yes on this quiz on Friday. The difference between skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle, to know that tendons connect muscles to bones and ligaments bones to bones. Those five things I expect you to know by Friday. Here again are some major muscle groups. I'm not going to ask you to know these. You do not have to know these by Friday. And I'm probably not even going to test most of these after the anatomy either. But it's good that you know them. The more of these you learn over time, the easier it's going to be for you when you have to learn them later in life. The digestive system is pretty straightforward. I'm not going to ask you to know all the different parts of the digestive system. I am going to ask you to understand the idea that you have how things work, that you swallow something in your mouth, it goes down your esophagus, from the esophagus enters your stomach, from the stomach it enters the small intestine. So basically, I'd like you to know that you go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. So if you know this pathway, you'll be pretty good. You also have to understand this. Here's the tube. This tube is continuous with the tube that's in your mouth. And so when you chew food, the food's inside this tube, which is still outside your body. When you get to your anus, which is the opening to the outside outside again, which is the exact opposite of your mouth, the inside, that opening is continuous with your mouth. The whole tube, it's still outside your body. So the fact that you have bacteria in here, inside where your food is being digested, is not dangerous to you because it's inside your body. It's these arteries and veins that carry your blood that bring in the nutrients and that filter out, do not allow bacteria, fungus, viruses, theoretically, through this barrier. And your body continuously has white blood cells probing and making sure to protect the inside and separate the inside from the outside. you have villi. They increase the surface area, that allows for more of diffusion, more absorption of materials through the membrane, which allows, again, for the larger the surface area, the more you're able to absorb, which is the purpose of the small intestine, to get the food and water from here, well, actually just food, the nutrients here, from inside your intestine into your bloodstream, which allows you to then to actually take advantage of the nutrients. So what do you have to know for the quiz? These 6 steps, the idea that you have an inside and an outside, that inside your intestine is still outside the body. All right, this space is still outside the body. You have to know that, try to imagine it. And that things get absorbed through this membrane into your bloodstream. All right, and that food then is what it gets circulated throughout the rest of your body. Now here, your major organs of your body, right? Of your digestive system, your liver, your gallbladder, your pancreas, your small intestine, large intestine, rectum, salivary glands, and mouth. For this exam, I'm not going to ask you all this, but I would like you to know all of the functions of each of these organs by the time we're done with dissecting the animals. So it's important that you know what each of these organs do. The pancreas, especially, because it's involved in insulin production, right? And the liver, because it does so much, is so important. But all of these have the important parts in your digestive system and regulating your body. That I think it's important you know them by the end of the unit, the anatomy unit, which won't be till the end of next month. So, but you need to know these, so start learning them now. Put them on index cards and start learning them. The respiratory system, again, now I don't need you to know all the details, but knowing that the trachea bifurcates or splits into two, one goes to the left lung, a right lung, and one goes to the left lung. It's opposite because we usually tell right and left based on the cadaver's position, not the human, not the observer's position. So this is our right, but the other person's the person we're looking at is their left. All right, you should know that the trachea is the big tube, and the bronchus is the small tube, and the bronchioles are the tiny tubes, right? And the alveoli are the smallest tube. Bronchitis is an infection here in these smaller tubes. The alveoli is the smallest of the tubes. Now, the whole point of the trachea, of the lungs, is to get oxygen from outside the body into your bloodstream. So you have these little capillary beds, which is the capillary bed. This is key. And this is going to be key for the respiratory system. It's going to be key for the circulatory system. And that's that where you artery, which here is a pink, and you have vein, which here is a purple, that these two have to meet because we have a closed circulatory system. In other words, the blood travels through from the heart in the artery. Actually, it's opposite here. I'm sorry. The blue is the artery and the red is the vein. It's opposite because here the blood coming to the lungs obviously has very little oxygen, and that blood needs to get oxygenated. That's why it's coming to the lungs, and then as it leaves, it has oxygen, so they designate that as red. And we'll discuss more of that when we discuss function and physiology. So when we're talking about this circulation, this blood circulation, the blood gets brought to the lungs and it surrounds each of these tiny, tiny, tiny little sacs called alveoli. And the thing that surrounds them are these capillaries. Now, this is an artery, arteriole or artery. This is a vein or venule. But the capillaries are the tiniest tubes of the entire blood supply. And it's here where the one single cell transports carbon dioxide into this tiny little sac, and you can't imagine how small this is. And this little sac full of oxygen from air from the outside that was brought into this tube, and it keeps splitting and splitting and splitting until it gets this tiny little sac here. The oxygen from in here goes into the blood, and the CO2 from the blood goes into the little tube. And as you breathe out, all the CO2 goes out, and fresh oxygen comes in. There's always some oxygen in here. That's why you can breathe oxygen into someone during CPR and still give them oxygen. There's always some oxygen here. It's just less than it would be after a breath. Then as the blood leaves the alveoli, and then again the whole lung, it has much more oxygen than when it came in with. Now that's pretty much the function of the lung. This is a function of the alveoli. Now these ideas, all this concept of mucous membranes and line the air passages, you should know that. As some of you are sick, you know this. A lot of you like to ask for tissues. This is what that stuff is. It's mucus that lines the inside of your respiratory system. And the whole point of mucus, that stuff that so many of you don't like, and none of us do, especially when we're sick, it covers the cilia, and what the mucus does is it catches the dirt, it catches any kind of invaders, and we're able to move the mucus with the cilia. The cilia are these little, you know what cilia are, maybe you don't. The cilia move back and forth, and they move the mucus out from the alveoli, from these little smaller tubes, up through the trachea, and of course out through your mouth when you're coughing or sneezing. When we inhale, then our air goes in the nostril, nasal cavity, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchus, bronchiole, and alveolus. So this is the flow of oxygen, or the flow of air from outside to inside. And of course, it's reversed when it goes out. What do you need to know from this? Okay, well, I think you need to know that the trachea splits into two. The trachea is the biggest tube. The bronchus is one of the smaller tubes. The bronchiole is the smallest tube. Alveoli are the sacs where the capillary beds, these are capillary beds. They look like a bed, don't they? The capillary beds then surround them, and they allow for exchange of gases. What two gases? Oxygen going into the blood and CO2 leaving the blood. That's the purpose of the respiratory system, and you should know the flow of air. And you should also know what does mucus do in the respiratory system. Let's think about it. One of the things, especially if you're going to anatomy camp, but even if you're not, when at the end of this package we discussed cigarette smoke, what would happen if these little sacs get filled with tar, or any of these little tubes get filled with tar or contaminants? What's going to happen to that airflow? And therefore, what happens is gas exchange. Keep thinking about that. Here you have all the functions of the major parts of the respiratory system. Do you have to know it? Oh, absolutely. You notice they have the heart here. The heart is an integral part of the respiratory system. It has to pump the blood into the system. Again, we don't include the heart in the respiratory system in this particular definition of the system, but just know that the heart is also involved. Do you need to know? What do you need to know for the quiz? We've already gone over it on the previous slide. It's appropriate that the next system is a circulatory system. Again, kind of a repeat from what we discussed. You'll notice that the circulatory system often includes the lungs. And there's that capillary bed that we talked about. They come together at the alveoli. You saw a close-up of that. Here's the capillary beds up at the head in your brain. Here are the capillary beds then at the digestive tract where you're absorbing food and getting rid of waste. Actually, not getting rid of waste. You're just absorbing food. Here are the capillary beds in the lower body that are also distributing blood to the tissues of your muscles. So what do you need to know for the quiz? You need to know steps 1, 2, 3, and 4. You need to know that the heart pumps the blood, that the heart is made of 4 chambers, the right atrium, left atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. You need to know that basic concept. You need to know that the flow of blood is from your body, from the lower part of your body, from the upper part of your body into the right atrium. As that muscle squeezes, a one-way valve lets the blood. I don't need you to know the names of the valves. I don't want you to try to memorize all the names of all the different valves or major arteries or veins or what have you. But just know that the blood comes from the top, from the brain, comes from the bottom of your body. Anything bringing blood to your heart is called a vein. And all that blood goes into your right atrium. As the heart squeezes, the blood goes into the right ventricle. And when the heart squeezes, it goes boom. The first boom is that squeeze. The blood comes in here. When this squeezes again, the blood tries to go out this valve, but it can't because it's a one-way valve, and instead goes out this valve, which puts it out into it sends it to the respiratory system. This is called a pulmonary artery. This pulmonary artery is called an artery because it's moving away from the blood, away from the heart, please think about this. All the blood was coming to the heart. It's going to the lungs. Is that blood going to have a lot of oxygen in it? No, it doesn't. It's going to have a lot of CO2 in it. So it needs to get rid of the CO2 and bring in the oxygen. This artery, the pulmonary arteries, the right and left, this is the only artery that has deoxygenated blood in the whole body. You need to know that. And if you understand this circulatory system, then you understand why that is. The only vein that has high oxygen levels is the pulmonary vein. Why? Because that vein is bringing the blood that has a lot of oxygen picked up at the lungs, has less CO2 because it got rid of the CO2 here at the lungs, and it's bringing it back to the left atrium. That left atrium is bringing the pulmonary veins from the left and right is bringing the blood back to the left atrium, which exactly what happened in the right atrium and the right ventricle. That blood gets pumped into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle it gets sent to the rest of your body through the aorta. So, what do you need to know? That flow that we just talked about, the idea that the pulmonary veins and arteries, which one has oxygen, which doesn't, which has high levels of oxygen, which has low levels of oxygen, which again, they're the only exception that in your body. Every other artery has more oxygen than the veins do. These two are the only exceptions that are reversed, and that's because of the function of these arteries and these veins. This vein functions to bring oxygenated blood back to the heart so that it could send that oxygen-rich blood to the rest of your body. You'll notice if you follow this, half the blood goes up into the brain and the upper part of your body, the other half sinks down in the rest of your body. It goes and gets distributed through the capillary beds to the tissues, and then from there the blood keeps going back up, and that's why we call it a closed circulatory system. All the blood in your body stays inside these tubes, from these large arteries and veins to these tiny little capillaries throughout your body. All right. Do I really need you to know AV node, SA node, and AV node? If you'd like to look at it and study it, that's great. At some point, you might cover it, but we really don't have a lot of time to talk about how the heart does its contractions. This is an electrical signal. When we do some neuron work later in the year, we may come back to SA node and AV node because these act as the pacemakers for the heart that keeps the rhythm going throughout your lifespan. But really, it's the 1, 2, 3, 4. The flow of the blood, how this heart's able to circulate the blood, these ideas of capillaries and what they do, that's what I'm going to quiz in the circulatory system. So what do capillaries do? What the flow of the blood through the circulatory system, this idea that this artery and this vein are reversed in the quality of the blood that's in them, and the fact that you go from right atrium to right ventricle to lungs, back to the left ventricle, left atrium to the left ventricle, and then through the aortic arch, up and down through the rest of the body. Know that, and you have ACE, the circulatory system, part of your exam. After this, the rest of this is all going to be on the exam. None of it's going to be on the quiz, so you are finished studying. If you know all that, you are finished studying for Friday. But you have to know it, all right? Know it. But let's go on. These are the major blood vessels of your body. The abdominal aorta, inferior vena cava. We're going to look at these. You're going to know them by the end of the unit. Not going to be necessary to know this for the quiz on Friday. But again, you should make some index cards and know them. We will identify most of these in the animals that we dissect. The lymphatic system, an important system. It allows for your blood vessels to, white blood cells to be transported throughout your body. A lot of the white blood vessels take the lymph system, the lymph vessels. This is where a lot of your immune system is doing its job. They're recognizing antigens, reproducing here in the lymph nodes. This lymph node is a giant grouping of what we call lymphocytes, which are white blood cells. They do the attacking. Here's a lymphocyte attacking bacteria literally surrounding it, eating, killing it. When bacteria invades your body goes to war, and these are your soldiers. And this lymph system, this lymph node, when you are sick, it swells up because you make a lot of soldiers. You need a lot of soldiers at war. And this swells up because it's bringing in bacteria. They're starting to make antibodies to the particular antigens. They're multiplying these lymphocytes, and your lymph nodes actually swell up with how many cells they're making. So it's important to know that when the doctor palpates or touches your neck or underneath your arm, they're looking to see if these are swollen, because it's a sign that you're sick and your body's fighting off a disease. So what's important to know about the lymphatic system? It's part of the circulatory system. It does circulate cells, blood cells. It does not circulate oxygen and nutrients. This circulatory system, this part of the circulatory system, is actually kind of the stuff that leaks out of your bloodstream mostly. Its interstitial fluid is here. You'll see interstitial fluid means the fluid in between the cells. Here's your capillary beds. But all the fluids that come out of there, they go into the lymphatic system. A lot less pressure in the lymphatic system. And it's really just the thing you have to know for the test eventually is that it is involved in the immune response. It's the part that helps you fight off disease. Here are the parts of your lymph system. You're making those drawings in your project. At some point, you will have to know these parts of your lymph system. What are lymph vessels? What do they do? What do lymph nodes do? Here you can identify all the lymph nodes. These are what the doctors try to look for, palpate to see if they're swollen. When you're sick, these things swell up. There's the spleen, the bone marrow. Again, where are your blood cells made? A lot of them are made right here in the bone marrow. Thymus, lymph node, tonsils. Your nervous system, again, not on the test, not on the quiz this Friday, but will be eventually on the exam. We will look at a nerve cell. I'll go into it in detail, but you should become familiar with the general anatomy of a nerve cell. We will talk about how it works. Do I need you to know all the parts of the brain? Absolutely not. It's not even going to be an issue for the exam in a month. I mean, this is not even, it's just not reasonable in a 9th grade biology class for me to ask you to do that. But you should know what a sensory input is. The idea that you have to first see it, the sensory, or hear it, or touch it, or hear it, or smell it. You have to integrate that data, that information that's coming in your brain. You have to somehow make sense of it. And then you have to send out a response to it. These 3 things happen all the time, every second during your life. And you should understand what white matter is versus gray matter, and that's pretty much it. I mean, knowing what that there is a cerebrum, there is a cerebellum, there's a brainstem. These things, this is what really regulates your basic functions like breathing and heart rate. The fact that these glands, the various functions, not going to be something we're going to be covering in this class. But it's good that you become familiar, kind of get a taste for what is going on here, because we will be seeing some brains when we dissect the animals. Here again are the major parts. I think these parts of the nervous system you definitely should know. Brain, cranial nerves, spinal cord, peripheral nerves, and what a ganglion is. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 terms you need to know. Again, not for the quiz, but by the end of the month. So get to know what these are. The specific nerves, we might look at the ulnar nerve, maybe the radial nerve, but the rest of these, there's so many of them. We could spend a whole year trying to get you to memorize all this, and I just don't think it's useful. But in getting these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 words into your brain, knowing what they mean, is very helpful, and I think you should do that. Again, at least by the end of the month, and you should start making index cards, soon. Here's some practice. I'm not going to ask you to know this. This is really an AP biology kind of task. It's good to get to, again, I just want you to become familiar with it. So just the action, the activity of doing this, I think it's very useful for you. it'll give you a basis of what we're talking about when we start talking about controlling the brain and what it means to control the brain. And here you have when you're looking at it, I think this part of the brain activity I think is very useful, because you're looking at what exactly the brain is not just this like lump of squiggly lines, but actually each part of this has a different function, right? I think that's important. Do I expect you to know the pons, medulla oblongata, cerebellum, cerebral cortex? No, I'm not going to ask you to know that, but I want you to study it anyways. I'm not, even though just kind of read it and become familiar with it. This activity again, I'm not going to ask you to do it. Well, I'm not going to ask you to. I'm not going to hold you accountable for it. I'm going to ask you to do it. I will hold you accountable as far as doing it is concerned, but I'm not going to ask you again to memorize all the different parts that we're talking about here and what they do. But I do want you to go ahead and do the activity, because I think there's some value in being able to distinguish between parts of the brain. When you dissect these animals, I'd like you to know that there are differences. Often when people look at a brain when they've just popped it out of a skull, or we've cut it out of a skull with a bone saw, or whatever it is that we're doing, often what people do is they don't really recognize the fact that there are different parts to the brain. Most generally, the brain can be divided into kind of lobes: occipital lobe, temporal lobe, parietal lobe, and frontal lobe. It's good that you have an idea, again, of the general landscape when you're looking at a brain. More practice, again, you should be doing it for your activity, but you're not going to get on a test, so don't spend time memorizing these unless you want to. If you want to, I think it wouldn't hurt you to memorize it, but I'm not going to put it on an exam. And if you're running out of time and you really need to focus and kind of kick things out and you really don't have time to memorize, then don't put your time into memorizing these. But it's good that you become familiar with them, so I'm still going to ask you to do the activity. Ditto here. Except that with this, when you're doing this activity, and you look at the homunculus in a minute, that we've actually identified places where if you had brain damage in this area, we would expect you to have problems with speech. People that have brain damage here smell things differently than they used to, hear things differently if the trouble's here. Reading issues, if we see problems in this area, people have trouble reading. Visual association, hearing, controlling their body movements. Each part of this brain actually does something different. I think that's amazing. And I'd say, except for that idea, I'm not going to ask you to memorize that the motor cortex is here, that the auditory association area is here in the temporal lobe, that smell is also in the temporal lobe, that taste is here on the parietal lobe. I'm not going to ask you to know those things, but I am going to ask you to understand that each part of the brain controls a different part of your experience as a human being. And this is kind of the homunculus, homunculus, however you want to pronounce it. It really goes through and tells you, where each part of the brain is what part of the brain controls what part of your body. So when you're looking at, for instance, here in the primary motor cortex, which is here, you see the arrow coming out, that this part here controls the muscles of your face. That this part of the brain, everybody has kind of similar contours, similar topography. This controls your hand. This part controls your leg. We've actually identified it to that detail. We've gone actually more detail now with fMRI studies and etc. But again, I'm not going to ask you to know the precentral gyrus and all that. All I'm asking you to know is that you have this idea. So when you do end up with going to AP biology, you have an idea of what they're talking about when you're looking at the brain. That the brain is not just a big ball of spaghetti, as the ancient Egyptians thought, just waste. This here again, it's an interesting little activity. I'm not going to ask you to do it, but just look through it and become aware that these do exist. Ditto here. Same. The endocrine system is very important, and we'll spend a little time here When we cover diabetes and insulin, we'll be talking about the endocrine system. When we talk about a woman's monthly cycle, when we talk about a lot of things, we talk about cell signaling. The endocrine system becomes very important, hormones, and how we handle things. So becoming familiar with this is going to be important. We will have whole lessons on the endocrine system, but just know that the endocrine system is about sending messages from one part of the body to the other using hormones. Read this and make sure that you understand the function of these various parts so that when we do have discussions, you're able to keep up. Students that read the stuff beforehand, take notes on it beforehand, are able to have intelligent discussions and actually learn things much faster than students that don't. In talking about the nervous system, this is the neuron. You definitely have to know the parts of the neuron for the exam, so you should become aware of it. There's 6 parts to it. We will talk about it. There'll be a whole lesson on it, but you need to do this activity and make sure you fill it out. Here are the parts of the endocrine system you will have to know for the test: the pancreas, the ovaries, the adrenal glands, the thymus. Interestingly, the ovaries is part of both the testes are also involved in the endocrine system, but the ovaries and testes, we're dealing with tissues that are both, or organs that are both involved in the reproductive system as well as the endocrine system. Pancreas, adrenal gland, thymus, etc. These glands are the tissue, the organs that make the hormones that control a lot of what goes on in you. The urinary system, I think that's pretty obvious what that's going on, what's happening there. Everybody, is repulsed by the idea of urine. You take in water, your water goes out by sweat and by urine. But the key is when you're looking at a kidney, that you look at a kidney and you think renal artery, this is the blood, and again, this is inside. The way we get the stuff from the inside out to get the waste out, this is actually their waste. This is the poop that comes out of you was never in your body. The urine that comes out of you was. That's why analyzing your urine is so important to doctors, what doctors do, what hospitals do, because the urine actually came out of your body. So if something's in there that shouldn't be, we're able to identify that it was actually in your body. So what's important for your exam when you're going to do this is that you understand the concepts of why we drink water. Understand that. That's important. How do kidneys remove the waste from the blood? The idea that these parts of the body, the kidneys, are filters, and that you understand the parts of the kidney. The fact that we're using osmosis. Now, we're not ready for this. We haven't covered osmosis yet. We will very soon. But you just need to understand the basic concepts and the basic anatomy of a kidney so that when we start talking about osmotic gradients and water flowing out, filtering out, you're going to be able to understand what we're talking about. Here again is your urinary system. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 parts. You need to know that for sure. This is your urinary system, and this is the urinary system for everyone. Your reproductive system, I think the key to the reproductive system, especially for the women, I think we'll just make sure that ovary, when you're looking at female anatomy, you're looking at ovary and uterus and cervix, and exactly where the bladder is. Explains why women that have children, they're pregnant. You see how the child actually pushes on the bladder, which is why women that are pregnant have to go to the restroom. Often have to go to the restroom a lot, not always. Sometimes they become constipated. If you look, this is large intestine. The child is growing here in her uterus. It's pushing on the large intestine, so you can see why a woman could also become constipated. That's all we need to know. I don't think we need to know any more about the anatomy of the reproductive system. I don't think it's important for what we have to do. There's so many parts to the human body we'd have to look over, and I just don't think it's worth our time. Now, the idea of the menstrual cycle and where it comes from is a good example of hormone regulation. So the fact that 1, 2, 3, and 4 is something we should all learn. We're going to talk about as an example the endocrine cycle and hormone regulation. The sperm and ovum, we're going to be talking about a lot as far as how we get a new human being, how sexual reproduction occurs in humans, but also just about every living system. where you got two haploid cells coming together to form a diploid cell. You don't know those terms yet. We will, and we'll look over all the details of DNA and RNA. Male reproductive system, again, it's interesting. We don't have a lot of time to spend on it, so we're just going to focus on hormone regulation, which we're going to use the menstrual cycle as our key, and ovum and sperm is going to be, we're going to discuss that when we talk about DNA replication, and then again in sexual reproduction. Again, I would rather you just, it's just not, again, we could memorize there's so many parts of the human body. We're running out of time. We're on 33 slides. I'm going to say, just know what that ovaries and testes, uterus, fallopian tube, I think these are key, and cervix, I think these are key. Vagina is just the opening to the cervix. It's not a big deal, but I just think that if you just know the idea where the position of the ovaries, and because that's going to become important, ectopic pregnancies, it's going to be important when we start talking about cervical cancer. So it's an issue that you need to know relatively where these organs are. The eye is an interesting organ, and we could spend a lot of time on it. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. You can do a lot of physics work with the eye, and interestingly, we can do a lot of what happens when the eye goes bad, things like scratch cornea or glaucoma. There's a lot of things that we could talk about and how the eye works. It's a good exercise. I just want so here you have kind of the general outline of the eye. If you understand that the eye is an extension of your brain, it's literally an extension of your brain. So you're looking at your eye, you're actually looking at part of your brain, at least the retina and the optic nerve that comes right from your brain. There are some muscles around the eye that you control, so it allows you to move the eye back and forth, side to side, up and down. And you know, a lot of people ask, what is the pupil? How does when you say pupil dilates? How does a pupil dilate? What are the eyelids? So it's really interesting to look at this. I would color this in. In fact, you have another slide in a second that has no labels on it, but that you should color so you get an idea of what it looks like and what other parts are. You should take a colored pencil and color it in. It's really interesting. The eye is one of the more amazing. I think this is a good use of our time, and the eye is a really good example of a multifunctional, organ that actually crosses a lot. It involves the neuromuscular system, neuromuscular. It's an input device that allows you to perceive light. It's an amazing, amazing structure. I wouldn't worry about knowing all these parts, although you should know them. Honestly, it's not that difficult. Maybe the fovea is one of the things that people don't know about that maybe we'll focus in on. But really, you should know what an eyelid is and what cones are and what an iris is already. But if you don't, take a look at this and kind of review it. Again, some more things that people should know, like retina. rods. You've at least heard of it. You may not know what they are, but you at least heard of it. We'll go over it to some extent. I'm not going to stress the eye, but it's a really good, nice example of a pretty complex organ. Here's some questions for you that you should look at. You can guess that I'm going to pull a lot of my test questions from these. 1 through 24 here. There's 25 through 51 here, so that's 51 questions. I think it's something that you should look at. I'm not necessarily going to go ask them. And most of the questions on the test, I'm going to discuss them in class before you actually get the test question. Again, at the end of the month, at the end of our anatomy month, we will finish this and ask you questions that thoughtful questions that ask you to apply your knowledge, not just memorize a bunch of different structures. This is a cell. I just want to I threw that in there just to remind you that we haven't even covered the cell yet. And after we cover the big anatomy parts, we'll go ahead and hit the cell. But just kind of go over the structures and try to make sense of them. This whole section here covers smoking and the impact of smoking on each of your organ systems. It's important that you understand how smoking causes death and how it impacts every part of your organ systems. Step by step, this section looks at how it impacts cardiovascular disease, how it impacts respiratory disease, etc. Okay, that's it. I went through the entire packet. You know now what the quizzes are going to be on. Please focus on the early part of the packet. For Friday, now you know where the important parts are throughout the entire packet. We will be covering some of these issues as we go through anatomy. I figure we'll spend anatomy in probably 3 more weeks once we get the animals. Until then, we'll go back and look at some of the molecular stuff and start defining what a cell is, and keep going with life. And hopefully by the end of by December, we will have finished most of our anatomy, or all of our anatomy. We'll understand what a cell is. We'll understand how it works into tissues and organs. We'll understand how they communicate, and we might even understand DNA and how it replicates. All right, buds. Have a good one. Study hard, and I'll see you tomorrow.